Really, it's the contest between the Philippines and China that's really been the most explicit over the last decade or so in this region. There's been a surge of Chinese activity and Chinese ships into this area.
In the first 6 months of 2026, the Philippines tracked 77 different Chinese Coast Guard vessels operating across the West Philippine Sea. That number was up from 68 a year earlier.
China Coast Guard Vessel 5901. This is Philippine Coast Guard Vessel.
But here is where the story gets much more interesting. During the same period, Chinese Navy deployments fell from 100 to 78, while maritime militia vessels dropped from 999 to 850. So why is one part of China's maritime presence growing while the others are shrinking? And more importantly, why would Beijing send more Coast Guard ships when it already has one of the world's most powerful navies? The answer could reveal a major change in how China is competing with the Philippines. Instead of putting a Chinese warship at the center of every confrontation, Beijing can place a Coast Guard cutter in disputed waters, challenge Philippine vessels, escort Chinese ships, issue warnings, and maintain pressure while describing the entire operation as law enforcement. To Manila, the effect can still be coercive. But politically, the situation is very different from a Chinese naval deployment. And that creates a dangerous strategic advantage. China can keep pushing forward without necessarily giving the Philippines a clear moment to say, this has now become a military attack. That is why the latest Philippine assessment deserves much closer attention. The Armed Forces of the Philippines says the growing presence of Chinese law enforcement vessels points to an increasing emphasis on the Coast Guard in the West Philippine Sea. And if that assessment is correct, then the real story is not simply that China is sending more ships. The real story is that Beijing may be changing the rules of the confrontation itself, using Coast Guard presence, maritime patrols, and research activity to build pressure, gather information, and gradually shape what happens on the water without crossing the line into open war. And now comes the question that could determine where this strategy leads. If China can increase its presence without firing a shot, how does the Philippines stop that presence from becoming the new normal? The most important thing about the latest figures is the pattern they reveal when the numbers are placed beside each other. Chinese Coast Guard activity increased, while the presence of the People's Liberation Army Navy and maritime militia decreased. And that combination suggests that Beijing does not necessarily need to keep its most obvious military assets constantly visible in order to maintain pressure on the Philippines. Instead, the Coast Guard can become the face of Chinese maritime activity, allowing Beijing to remain physically present in contested waters while presenting those operations as routine law enforcement rather than direct military coercion.
The South China Sea is one of the world's busiest shipping lanes. Much of what the world buys and sells passes through the stretch of water. But who controls this sea is hotly disputed. The Philippines says part of this sea falls into its exclusive economic zone, but China has a very different view, and it's led to an increasing number of confrontations at sea.
That gives China a different kind of strategic flexibility, because a Coast Guard encounter creates a different political problem for Manila than a direct encounter with a Chinese warship. If a Philippine vessel encounters a PLAN destroyer, everyone immediately understands the potential consequences, and both governments know that a dangerous maneuver or collision could rapidly become a military crisis. When the vessel is a Coast Guard cutter, however, Beijing can frame the encounter around maritime enforcement, while the Philippines has to decide how strongly it can respond without allowing the confrontation to escalate beyond the immediate dispute. This is the essence of the gray zone environment developing across the South China Sea. The pressure can be real, the confrontation can be physical, and the strategic objective can be significant. But the actions are deliberately kept below the level of an obvious military attack. Beijing can therefore continue testing Philippine reactions, maintaining presence, and challenging Philippine operations, while making it much harder for Manila to justify a major military response to every individual encounter. A Coast Guard vessel may look less threatening than a destroyer, but its usefulness in a contested maritime environment can actually come from precisely that difference. It can remain on station for long periods, conduct repeated patrols, challenge other vessels, and establish a persistent presence while operating under a law enforcement narrative. And because the same ship can return repeatedly to the same location, Beijing can gradually build a pattern of activity that becomes increasingly familiar to everyone operating in the area. That repetition is strategically important because maritime competition is not always decided by one dramatic confrontation. Sometimes it is decided by who can remain present for longer, who can return more frequently, and who can gradually make its presence seem normal. A single Chinese Coast Guard patrol around a disputed feature is an incident, but hundreds of patrols over several years create an entirely different operating environment. Because Philippine forces are no longer responding to something unusual, but to something that has become routine. This is why the increase from 68 to 77 different Chinese Coast Guard vessels matters, even though the number itself does not prove that China has gained control of Philippine waters. What it demonstrates is the scale and persistence of the Chinese maritime presence. While the simultaneous decline in PLAN and maritime militia deployments suggests that Beijing may be increasingly comfortable using law enforcement vessels as the instrument through which it manages pressure. Scarborough Shoal provides one of the clearest examples of why persistent Coast Guard activity matters. Chinese Coast Guard operations around the shoal have become a regular feature of the South China Sea dispute. An analysis of Chinese patrol patterns has identified Scarborough Shoal as one of the priority areas for Chinese maritime activity. The strategic significance is not simply that Chinese vessels appear there, it is that they continue returning. And repeated presence creates a very different situation from an isolated deployment. When a vessel arrives once, the other side can treat the event as a temporary confrontation. But when that vessel or similar vessels return again and again, the opposing side must constantly allocate ships, aircraft, personnel, and attention simply to monitor and respond to the activity. Over time, that creates pressure without requiring a formal declaration of war. A Chinese Coast Guard ship patrols the area, Philippine vessels monitor it, another encounter occurs, warnings are exchanged, ships maneuver around one another. And then the same process happens again days or weeks later. Each event may appear limited when viewed individually, but together they establish a pattern in which Chinese vessels are increasingly present and Philippine forces are increasingly forced to react. That is how gray zone pressure becomes powerful, not through one dramatic victory, but through accumulation. Now the map becomes even more important. Move north from the West Philippine Sea toward Luzon, then continue toward the Batanes island group, and beyond Batanes lies Taiwan. Between northern Luzon and Taiwan is the Bashi Channel, a strategically important maritime passage connecting the South China Sea with the Philippine Sea and the wider Western Pacific. This geography makes northern Philippine waters particularly sensitive because activity around Batanes is no longer simply about a dispute over a distant feature in the South China Sea. It is occurring close to one of the maritime corridors linking several major strategic theaters. The Philippines has to watch these waters because they are close to its own territory, while China has an obvious interest in understanding and monitoring activity around a corridor that connects the South China Sea with the waters farther east. And Chinese Coast Guard activity has already appeared around Batanes. In August 2025, 3 Chinese Coast Guard vessels were observed operating around the island province, in a pattern that effectively placed Chinese vessels on both sides of Batanes. That development becomes even more significant when viewed alongside the fact that Philippine, American, and Japanese maritime exercises expanded toward northern Batanes and the Bashi Channel in February 2026. The point is not that every Chinese Coast Guard patrol around Batanes is evidence of preparation for war, because the available evidence does not establish that. The point is that Beijing is demonstrating an ability and willingness to operate farther north, in waters whose strategic geography makes persistent maritime presence increasingly important. The Bashi Channel deserves attention because it links the South China Sea to the Philippine Sea, meaning that activity in this area can have implications well beyond the immediate waters where a particular vessel is operating. It is also relevant to submarine movement and underwater surveillance, which makes the surrounding maritime environment strategically important even when there are no obvious naval formations visible on the surface. For China, understanding this environment can improve awareness of maritime traffic and military activity moving between different parts of the Western Pacific. For the Philippines, the area represents part of its immediate maritime security environment and sits close to its northern territory. The strategic importance therefore comes from geography itself. Whoever wants to understand movement through this part of the Western Pacific has a reason to pay attention to Batanes and the Bashi Channel. And this is where the rise of the China Coast Guard becomes more interesting. China does not need to send a major naval task force into the area every time it wants to demonstrate presence. A Coast Guard vessel can operate there, observe activity, interact with other vessels, and create a regular Chinese footprint. The platform may be less heavily armed than a destroyer, but the information and presence it provides can still be strategically useful. That leads to another part of the latest Philippine concern: Chinese research vessels. In May 2026, the Philippine Coast Guard detected 4 Chinese research vessels operating in Philippine waters and responded by deploying ships and aircraft to challenge them. One of the most significant cases involved the Chinese research vessel Xiangyang 33, which Philippine authorities said was conducting unauthorized maritime research near Iroquois Reef. It is important not to overstate what this means. A Chinese research vessel is not automatically a military intelligence ship, and scientific research vessels can perform legitimate oceanographic and environmental missions around the world. The strategic concern is instead about what repeated surveys can reveal about the maritime environment, particularly when those surveys take place in waters that are already strategically contested. Research can provide information about seabed conditions, water characteristics, currents, geological structures, and acoustic conditions, all of which can contribute to a better understanding of how vessels operate within a particular maritime environment. That creates a second layer of Chinese activity. The Coast Guard creates a presence. The research vessels create knowledge. And together, those activities can give Beijing a more detailed understanding of the waters in which its own maritime forces are operating. Again, that does not mean every research mission is a military preparation exercise, but it explains why Manila is watching the activity closely and why the combination of Coast Guard presence and research operations deserves more attention than either category would receive on its own. This is where the entire pattern begins to make sense. China has multiple maritime instruments, and each one performs a different function. The Coast Guard can maintain visible presence and enforce China's stated maritime claims. Research vessels can collect information about the physical maritime environment. Maritime militia vessels can add numbers and ambiguity, while the PLAN remains the conventional military force capable of providing hard power when Beijing chooses to display it. The decline in PLAN deployments, therefore, should not automatically be interpreted as China becoming less interested in the South China Sea. The more interesting possibility is that China is increasingly comfortable using lower-profile instruments for day-to-day pressure while retaining its conventional military capabilities in the background. That is precisely what makes gray zone competition difficult to counter. If China sent naval warships into every contested area every day, the strategic message would be obvious. And regional governments would have a much easier time describing the behavior as military coercion. But when Coast Guard vessels conduct the majority of visible activity, Beijing can keep the confrontation framed around law enforcement while still maintaining a persistent physical presence. The Philippines is therefore dealing with a problem that cannot be solved simply by counting warships. It has to monitor Coast Guard vessels, research ships, maritime militia, and naval forces together, because the strategic effect comes from the combination. The most important danger is that gray zone pressure does not require a single dramatic escalation. It can happen incrementally. A Coast Guard vessel patrols a disputed area, then begins challenging Philippine vessels, then starts escorting Chinese ships, then conducts more frequent patrols, then uses increasingly aggressive maneuvering. And eventually the presence itself becomes so routine that the new operating environment feels normal. That is why incidents around Scarborough Shoal matter beyond the individual encounters themselves. Analysis of the area has recorded extensive interaction between Chinese and Philippine law enforcement vessels, demonstrating that this is not an occasional event, but a recurring feature of maritime competition. The same logic can apply farther north. A Chinese Coast Guard vessel operating near Batanes may attract attention the first time. Repeated activity creates a pattern. Patterns create familiarity. And familiarity can eventually become normalization. The strategic objective does not necessarily have to be a dramatic seizure of territory. It can be a gradual change in who is present, who is monitoring the area, who is responding to whom, and whose activity becomes routine. This creates a serious challenge for Manila because the Philippines has an enormous maritime area to monitor and cannot simply place a large naval force everywhere at once. Detecting Chinese activity is one problem. Maintaining a continuous Philippine presence in response is another. Satellites can identify vessels. Aircraft can monitor them. ACE data can track movements. Coast Guard ships can respond. Navy vessels can provide additional capabilities. But all of these systems require resources, and every repeated Chinese patrol creates another demand on Philippine surveillance and maritime forces. That is why the Philippine response increasingly depends on a network of Coast Guard vessels, Navy ships, aircraft, maritime domain awareness systems, and cooperation with partners. The goal is not merely to know that Chinese vessels are present, but to maintain enough Philippine awareness and presence that Chinese activity cannot occur without being monitored, documented, and challenged when necessary. The challenge is finding the right response. If Manila reacts too aggressively to every Coast Guard encounter, it could create unnecessary escalation. If it reacts too weakly, Beijing could conclude that its tactics are becoming increasingly effective. That is the central problem of gray zone competition. The Philippines has to resist pressure without allowing the confrontation to become a war. The latest numbers therefore deserve attention, not because they prove that China is preparing to attack the Philippines, but because they reveal a possible change in how Beijing is applying maritime pressure. The number of Chinese Coast Guard vessels monitored by the Philippines increased from 68 to 77 during the first half of the year, while PLAN deployments declined from 100 to 78, and maritime militia vessels fell from 999 to 850. That is a meaningful pattern. It suggests that the Coast Guard is becoming an increasingly important instrument of Chinese activity. At the same time, Chinese research vessels are appearing in Philippine waters, including the Xiang Yanghong 33 near Iroquois Reef, creating concerns about maritime survey activity and the information being collected. And farther north, Chinese Coast Guard operations around Batanes demonstrate that Beijing's maritime presence is not confined to the better-known flashpoints farther south. The result is a more complicated operating environment for Manila. China can be present. China can gather information. China can challenge Philippine vessels. And it can do all of this without constantly putting its most obvious military forces at the center of the confrontation. This is ultimately why the latest development deserves attention. The South China Sea is not simply becoming a place where China and the Philippines occasionally confront each other. It is becoming a place where the two sides are competing over who gets to operate normally. China's Coast Guard presence can make Philippine operations more difficult. Chinese research vessels can increase Beijing's knowledge of the maritime environment. Repeated patrols can normalize Chinese activity. And the Philippines has to respond continuously simply to maintain its own presence. That is a different kind of strategic competition from a conventional naval confrontation. There may be no single day when the balance suddenly changes. Instead, the environment can shift gradually. More patrols, more information, more encounters, more pressure, more normalization, and eventually, a maritime space in which one side has become much more comfortable operating than the other. That is the real significance of the 77-vessel figure. It is not evidence that China has suddenly won the South China Sea. It is evidence that Beijing may be refining the tools it uses to compete there. China does not need to defeat the Philippine Navy in a conventional battle to make life more difficult for Manila. It can use Coast Guard vessels to maintain presence. It can use research vessels to understand the maritime environment. It can use repeated patrols to test Philippine responses. And it can gradually make Chinese activity increasingly familiar across strategically important waters. The Philippines, meanwhile, has to make sure that its own presence remains equally persistent. That is why Scarborough Shoal matters. That is why the West Philippine Sea matters. That is why Batanes matters. And that is why the Bashi Channel matters. They are all connected by the same strategic question: who gets to remain present, operate freely, and shape the maritime environment over time? The latest Philippine figures suggest that China may be answering that question with a new combination of Coast Guard pressure and maritime information gathering. And if that trend continues, the most important development may not be the arrival of another Chinese warship. It may be the gradual appearance of something far less dramatic: a Coast Guard vessel, a research ship, another patrol, another challenge, another encounter, until one day the activity that once looked extraordinary has become the new normal. That is how the gray zone changes the balance, not through one battle, but through persistent presence, accumulated information, and pressure that never quite becomes a war.